Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that break. I know the donuts were pretty good, at least I thought so. So we all get into TQIP for a few reasons. One, to learn from each other, and the other is to get our benchmark report. And if you're like me and barely passed statistics in college, sometimes it's hard to read that benchmark report. So today we're going to have Amy Miskovich and Ben Baer talk to you about what TQIP does to get the data prepared for the benchmark report.
Thanks, Amy. I am the other Amy, another Amy. I'm Amy Miskovich. I am the lead statistician for TQIP. This is my colleague, Ben. We're going to be co-presenting today. We are two people of a 5-person team whose part of our job is to take all the lovely NTS data that is submitted, play with it, analyze it, and produce it back as a TQIP benchmark report for you all. We don't have any disclosures, so today we are going to be talking all about the data, specifically what happens to the data between the collection via the call for data, review, transformation into the TQIP sample, further evaluation, modeling, and finally the presentation of the results as part of the TQIP benchmark report. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ben for the first part of our talk.
Thank you, Amy. So to begin, we're going to start with the National Trauma Data Standard, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but it's where our data starts. So this is a standardized data set, and it defines what data you'll be submitting to us and how you're defining injuries, patients, pre-existing conditions, and all of those things. When we talk about standardization, that's really important to us because that's what ensures that we're comparing apples to apples. Without standardization, everyone might be meaning something a little bit different. With standardization, we're able to compare hospitals from across the country and even our international partners with each other. So this begins with a quarterly call for data. 4 times a year, you'll submit your data to us. This date began on November 1st this year, and will be ending December 7th. It is sometimes a bit flexible due to things that are going on. You've probably recently received a couple emails from us about that, but it ends on December 7th, which means that you still have time to submit your data to us once you get back to your center. When you submit your data, you'll get a couple automatic reports, the validation summary report and the submission frequency report. And that just gives you some preliminary information, and we always ask that you just take a look at those and review those and make sure that they make sense to you. You'll get a bit more detail on those in a future talk. But if you're unfamiliar, this is what they look like. The submission frequency report is on the left, and the validation summary report is on the right. So the submission frequency report will just tell you how many patients you submitted to us and some rough demographic information about them. The validation summary report just has the results of some automatic checks that are performed on the data to make sure that the data is valid. So if you report that all of your patients are 5 years old, that won't trigger anything in the validation summary report because that is a valid age, but it is something you might be able to discover by looking at the submission frequency report. Once we have the NTDS data, there's a winnowing process where we have to take that data and we filter out both patients and centers who don't meet the TQIP inclusion criteria. This is also where we are going to transform and some of the data elements to create the variables that we use in the modeling process and to create the various tables and graphs and summary statistics that you'll see in your benchmark report. So there are 2 types of inclusion criteria, center-level inclusion criteria and patient-level inclusion criteria. So we'll start with the center-level inclusion criteria. First, you have to be an ACS or a state-verified trauma center, either level 1, level 2, or level 3, or pediatric. If you're in the process of becoming verified, you can sometimes also receive a report. You have to be enrolled in TQIP. This one's pretty self-explanatory. If you're not in TQIP, you're not going to submit your data to TQIP, you're not going to get a TQIP report, and you're also probably not going to be attending the TQIP conference, so hopefully no one's in that category. So those first 2 categories are things that should remain very stable for your center. The third category is data submitted on time and in sufficient quality. My colleague Amy is going to have more detail on that, but right now I just want to note that we strive that all of our centers who meet those first 2 criteria also meet that third criteria. And now on the right, you'll see from our references, the official criteria there. We're going to be referring to these references a lot. That's because we think they're great. We refer to the references ourselves throughout our work. If I have a question, the first thing I do is I look at the references, and it's what we encourage all of you to do as well. The next kind of inclusion criteria is patient inclusion. And this is a bit different because every center is going to have a large number of patients who don't qualify for TQIP. So first, the patient must be the correct age for their center. This means 16 or over for an adult center and 18 or younger for a pediatric center. Level 3 centers, all of your patients of any age can qualify. Next, the trauma type. We're only looking at patients with blunt or penetrating trauma or who have abuse of any trauma type, and this is defined by the external cause code. Injury severity. The patient has to have at least one valid AAS 0508 injury with a severity between 3 and 6 in AAS chapters 1 through 8, or an equivalent AAS 2015 injury. They have to either be admitted to the hospital or have died in the emergency department. If they're discharged from the ED to their own home or to a jail or similar facility, they won't be included in TQIP. And they have to not be excluded. This is kind of a hodgepodge of different things. What we mean by this is if a patient is discharged 30 days or more after the final date for the report, they're excluded. If the patient has an advance directive to withhold life-sustaining care, they're excluded. If they are what we define as DOA, we define DOA based on initial SBP, pulse, and GCS score, and one of those can be missing and the patient can still qualify as DOA. And finally, we also exclude patients with severe burns as defined in the TQIP reporting code sets. Once again, the references will lay all this out in a lot more detail, and if you have questions about a patient, you can also come and ask us. So the obvious question is, why aren't all NTDS patients used for TQIP? After all, in a simple level, it seems like the more patients, the better, right? Well, we're interested in certain outcomes, and fortunately, those outcomes like mortality are relatively rare across the whole NTDS sample. Most patients do live, which is good news, but in terms of prediction, we want to select the more severely injured patients. At the same time, we want those patients to have a chance of survival. From our perspective, it doesn't make sense to include a patient who has an advance directive to withhold life-sustaining care because that's not giving an accurate measure of your center. And we also want to make sure that the patients are across a similar time frame. We want to be comparing the same year. We don't want to look at someone's data from 5 years ago and comparing it to someone else's data from this year. We do all that to minimize uncontrollable bias across trauma centers. The goal of TQIP and our modeling is not necessarily to make the most accurate prediction on whether or not an individual patient will live or die, but it's to focus on providing feedback to you as a center on the patients we think that feedback will be most useful for. We're interested in outcome and quality improvement. So now a little bit about who these excluded patients are. For the level 1 and 2 adult fall 2023 TQIP report, about 580,000 NTDS patients were excluded from TQIP. The most common reason, 90% of these patients were excluded due to having a low injury severity score. The next most common reason, about 10%, was due to age. About 3% of patients were excluded due to having a non-blunt or penetrating trauma type or not having abuse. And about another 3% were excluded due to having a pre-existing advance directive to withhold life-sustaining care. About 1% were DOA, and a very small number had severe burns. Note, a patient can be excluded for multiple reasons. About a quarter of patients are excluded for more than one reason, so those percentages do not add up to 100. So while these records are not included in TQIP, they still can provide direction for future report contents and other possible research projects. So we would never want you to not report a patient to us because you think, oh, this patient isn't going to qualify for TQIP. We still want all the NTDS qualified patients. So when you do receive your report, one of the first things in it is the TQIP patient inclusion by month. This is a little small, but it's in section 1. And what this basically does is it breaks down on a month-to-month basis how many NTDS qualified patients you reported to us, how many of those patients qualified for TQIP, and what that percentage is. When you take this, we want you to look at it, and first off, just make sure there aren't any months with 0 people. We do sometimes have centers who accidentally skip a month of reporting, and that's something we would prefer for you to fix. But also you want to look and make sure that that count is consistent across the months, or if it's not consistent in a way that makes sense to you. Maybe you had a really bad blizzard in January, so you had a lot of car crashes and your January is high, and it makes sense to you that it's high. That's fine. Remember that you are the experts on your center's data. We're looking at every center across the country here, so we can't go into that level of detail. So we rely on you to notice things that don't make sense. I also want to note that the percentage of NTDS patients that don't meet TQIP doesn't really have anything to do with what you do as a center. These are either characteristics of the patient like age or things that happened to the patient before they arrived at your center. So we don't really look or compare at what percent of patients qualify at one center versus another center. It's not really used for that, just comparing against yourself. Next, I'm going to discuss new and changed data elements. So when a new element is added to the NTDS, we evaluate it for its inclusion in TQIP. And we ask ourselves 2 main questions. Should we use this data element in a model? Or should we report it in a table or graph or some other summary statistic? All of these decisions, we don't just make as statisticians, we always make in conjunction with our medical director and our various committees. There can be a substantial time interval between the addition of an element into the NTDS and its time in implementation of TQIP. This is because we need to take that time to collect the data, to give all the centers time to make sure they understand how to collect the data, and make sure that everyone is doing it in that standardized manner that I mentioned earlier. And then we need to verify that data quality and run our tests on it and make our presentation to Dr. Nathans. We're going to go through a couple examples now. The first example is midline shift and pupillary response. So this is a variable that a pilot project began in 2014 where a few centers started collecting that data. This pilot project worked well, and so it was added to the 2016 NTDS Data Dictionary, and in January 1st, 2016, data collection began. It then took a few years before we had enough of that data that we began to add it into our TQIP data sets. Once we had access to it there, we began to do a statistical analysis and review. So we had to ask ourselves a few different questions. Is everyone reporting this data in a very similar way? But also, these are variables that are only collected if a patient meets certain criteria. So we had to look at 2 things. Are centers reporting it for patients who don't meet that criteria? That wouldn't be good. But also, if centers are not reporting it for patients who do meet the criteria, we also needed to look at that. Finally, these aren't just simple yes or no variables. Pupillary response, for instance, you can have either both eye reactive, one eye reactive, or neither eye reactive. So we had to look and see, should we have those as 3 different variables, or should we group 2 of those together? Ultimately, we did this review, we presented to our medical director, and the determination was made that it would be added both as a model variable in TQIP, and it would also be added to our injury characteristics table. And that was added in the fall 2021 benchmark report for our level 1 and 2 adult centers. So that process took a while, but we can move quickly sometimes. So I know you're all kind of sick about talking about it, but COVID. March 2020, COVID was declared a national emergency. And we know that had an immediate and immense effect at hospitals across the country, including trauma centers. So we began to ask ourselves, how can we include it in the data? Now, both suspected and confirmed COVID were fortunately available to us as ICD-10 codes, meaning that we didn't have to add them as new data elements to the data dictionary, so we were able to get them fast. Also, because of the effect that COVID was having in hospitals, we pushed back the call for data. As I said earlier, we do have to do that sometimes, and that gave us some additional time to analyze that data. So we began immediately to do a statistical analysis and review. We found that confirmed COVID was being reported very consistently across centers, and that it was an important factor and worked in our models. So in the spring 2021 TQIP benchmark report, confirmed COVID was added both as a model variable and also to the patient characteristics table. And that represented, the spring 2021 report was the first report to contain that post-March 2020 data. And we also have to change variables sometimes. So for instance, our sex variable was initially male or female for a long time. On our end, we actually only reported the percentage of patients at your center who were male. And then we just let you figure out the remainder as the percentage who were female. But non-binary was eventually added as a data element. So we then had to decide how are we going to handle that. We began a statistical analysis and review, and we ultimately found that not enough patients were being reported as having non-binary sex for it to be included as a model variable, and we also didn't really feel comfortable including the patient characteristics table with such low counts. So instead, we added female to the patient characteristics table instead. So now instead of just reporting the percentage of patients who are male, we report both male and female. If those add up to less than 100, the remaining percentage would be the percentage of non-binary patients at your facility. We did not make any changes to the model at this time. However, there are more changes coming down the pike on this, to the sex and gender data elements that will be coming in the near future. So when those elements do happen, we are once again going to have to collect that data, review it, and make a further decision down the line. After we receive the NTDS data, we have to modify some of it to create and transform it into the variables that we use in our statistical processes. Some of this is relatively straightforward. We have to change text into numbers. We're statisticians, we like numbers. Our models run on numbers. Our tables are all about numbers. So if something's like yes or no, we have to change that to a 1 or a 0. Next, data elements with multiple levels, such as discharge disposition, might need to be transformed into multiple variables. In statistics, we call this dummy variables. So instead of having one variable like discharge disposition that has multiple different possible responses, we create one for mortality, one for discharge to home, etc. Each of those being a yes or no variable. We also have to create some of our own variables. One area where we do this a lot is our time to procedure variables. So for instance, we know the time a patient arrived at your facility. We know the time a patient had their first angiography at your facility. The difference between those we use to create a time to angiography variable. We do this for a variety of procedures where we want to know how quickly they're happening at your center. At every step along the way, we also have to evaluate the data quality. So as I said earlier, there's some automatic times where the system will invalidate data, but we also have to apply our own level of what we kind of call our common sense data validation. For instance, there can't be any time travel. You're not allowed to treat a patient before they arrive at your facility. There are other times, like I said with pupillar response, where if you tell us someone had both eyes reactive, but they had a leg injury, we aren't gonna count that. We're gonna invalidate that data. We also compare previous to current year's data, both at the center level and patient level. Once again, this is an area where we often have to rely on you for help, because maybe there's a reason why your center had a sudden increase or decrease in patients or the characteristics of your patients. You might not know that, and we might have to reach out to you. We also look at extreme values. We do this, once again, at the patient and center level. We look at, for instance, who is the tallest patient? If someone reported a 20-foot tall patient, we're going to be a bit skeptical of that. At the center level, if you report one 7-foot tall patient to us, we believe it. If all of your patients are 7 feet tall, we're going to call you and confirm that that actually happened. Finally, we look at missingness. My colleague Amy is going to talk about this more, but this is just if you're not reporting certain things to us, that might affect what kind of report you receive, or if you receive a report, especially if those are model variables. We also have to use multiple imputation, sometimes to predict and provide certain estimates for what we think the true value of those data elements would be if you had answered, based on the known information about that patient. So why do we do that? What is the problem with inaccurate data? In one word, it's bias. It biases your result. It could mean that a patient is falsely included or excluded from the TQIP sample. If you report their age wrong, If you falsely report them as being too young in your adult center or too old as a pediatric center, then they might not be included in your data or might be included when they shouldn't have, and that'll have an impact on your data. It also can affect our patient prediction. If you tell us someone's younger than they are, or they might seem healthier than they are, and we might think, oh, this patient has a very high likelihood of survival, when maybe in reality their likelihood of survival was very low. That's gonna bias your result in a negative manner from your center's perspective. Also, if not all injuries are submitted, injuries that are associated with worse survival outcomes might not be considered. It's important to remember, from a statistical point of view, injuries that may seem more superficial, like head lacerations, might have a higher association with mortality than more severe injuries on an AIS score. The good news is, though, if a record is found to have been submitted with incorrect data, you can resubmit that data to us at the next call for data. And if that patient still matches their correct time frame, they will be included in the next reports with that amended data. Now, once again, I turn over to Amy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. But I know we've already said a lot today. We have a lot more to say. So after we do review all the TQIP inclusion criteria and evaluate for every single patient, and we restrict the data to the appropriate time frame, we evaluate each center for the consistency of admissions and the data quality to determine full inclusion in the risk-adjusted modeling process. So what does that mean? We have two types of model exclusions by center: data submission exclusions and data quality exclusions. Now, the good news is that the number of centers that we have been excluding due to these reasons has been decreasing over the past several years, which is great job. But let's review what this means, and maybe we could get that down to 0. Data submission exclusions. So what does that mean? So if a center has more than a 2 consecutive quarter gap in submissions for the time frame eligible for a report, then you would be excluded from the models. Now, I know the dates here are not so important, but we're looking from Q1, I think 2020 in this particular example, to Q3, 2021, and you can see in the middle there's 3 pink cells, 3 consecutive quarters where this center has not submitted any data. This center would be excluded from all modeling in this case. Similarly, a delinquency of 3 or more quarters in submissions at the end of the time frame eligible for the report would also exclude a center. So this is another scenario that we're looking at, Q1 2021 through Q1 2022, and you can see that there's 3 consecutive quarters at the end there where there has been no submitted data. And so this center would be excluded from modeling as well. We do give new centers a little bit of a break. They get a little larger window. We do want to get them comfortable and included in the program. Data quality exclusions are another type of thing that we evaluate to see if a center should be excluded. So we exclude a center from all models if one of the 5 variables listed there, sex, pulse, SBP, GCS motor, and interfacility transfer, is missing at a rate of 50% or more. If any of those very important variables are missing for more than half your patients, then we simply just don't have enough data to include you in the model. Similarly, if the total unknown rate across all of the model variables is 10%, so not only the 5 that are there, but all of the variables included in all of the models, if those are missing at more than 10%, then we are a suspect of the data quality as well, and then we would exclude that center from all models. We do look at the major hospital event models separately to evaluate the presence of the hospital event outcomes, and if any of those outcomes are unknown at a rate of more than 10% in aggregate, then we would exclude that center from the major hospital event models. They would still be included in the mortality models. And narrowing that down a little bit further, looking at the specific hospital event models, so the AKI, SSI type models, if any of those specific injuries were missing at that rate of 10%, then that center would be excluded from that particular model. This is a new exclusion criteria that I think we just introduced in spring. I'm not actually sure we've actually used that, so that's great. Why is it important to exclude these centers with these data submission or data quality issues? Again, as Ben just mentioned, it's bias. If we included these centers, it could introduce bias to the model. So consider an example where a center might just submit 3 months of data. Those months happen to be December, January, and February. Those are obviously winter months that could be overrepresenting by weather-related injuries, fall, other seasonal things, and that would be biased against 12 months of submissions from many other centers. Or if we're just missing too much data, too many explanatory variables, then that's not going to result in a good model. Centers that are excluded from modeling will still receive a benchmark report, but all of their risk-adjusted tables will be empty. Centers that are enrolled in TQIP but don't submit any data at all don't receive a report at all. What variables do we use in our models? This is a question we get sometimes. So model variables are selected for their statistical and/or their clinical relevance in outcome prediction, and we can loosely group them in the 4 categories that are seen here. So we have demographics, things like age and sex, vitals upon admission in the ER, so initial SBP, initial pulse, pre-existing conditions, so the health of the patient prior to their injury, and injury characteristics themselves, and these are obviously super important. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these. So how do we incorporate the injury characteristics into our models? We do this a couple different ways. We do look at the highest AIS severity by body region. So the 8 body regions, we look at the highest AIS severity for any region that happened in those 8 body regions, and then we include those each as a model variable. Probably most importantly, there's our risk ratios, and we do get a lot of questions on this, and this is a confusing topic. A risk ratio is the proportion of patients who survived and or did not experience a hospital event for each AIS code. So these are based on years of historical TQIP data that we have, and we do update these before every single report, so we're always using the latest and most current data. Then for each patient, we calculate their survival risk ratio or their hospital event risk ratio, depending on outcome, by using the product of the risk ratios for up to their 3 worst injuries. Depending on outcome or cohort, we do use 2 sometimes. And I want to emphasize here that when we say worst, that's defined as those injuries that are most associated with those adverse outcomes, not necessarily those that are clinically worst when considered individually. So as Ben mentioned, a broken femur, very serious injury, a head laceration on its own doesn't seem so serious, but head lacerations, as you all know, are often accompanied by other head injuries, TBI, things that are more associated with adverse outcomes, excuse me. Model variables do vary by outcome and cohort. What do we not use in models? So only data elements that represent the condition of the patient on arrival to ED are used to assess the care. So things like facility characteristics, like staffing, bed size, those are not part of our models. Care received in the ED, because we're trying to assess this care, including that care as explanatory variables would not be appropriate. And post-discharge data, we don't have any access to post-discharge data. As Jim talked about earlier today, we would love to get our hands on that and maybe build some models on some new outcomes. That would be great. Additional data elements and process of care, we do present a lot of information of this in the report and descriptive tables in the end of the report. So as you all know, hospitals differ with respect to their patient case mix, demographics, and injury severity. Comparing these raw income rates for 2 hospitals is not appropriate. If I were to show you these charts right here, would you be able to assess which hospitals are providing better care? I hope not. I can't do it. It might appear obvious, but Hospital A and Hospital B could be serving extremely different populations, so it would not be appropriate to compare any raw event rates. So how do we get around that? We need to account for those patient-to-patient differences in order to quantify those hospital-to-hospital differences, and we do that by using hierarchical linear modeling. This is used in the case of nested data, which is what we're talking about right here. Patients are not independent of each other simply because they are seen within the same hospital as each other. So this methodology creates risk-adjusted estimates of performance at your hospital relative to the average TQIP hospital, and that allows TQIP to compare hospitals in a way that simulates performance with regard to a similar patient population. So you may have seen a chart like this before. We review every model for every product, every cohort, and every outcome, every single report to make sure that they are meeting our high standards. One way we do that is we look at the C-index to determine model discrimination. A C-index reflects the ability of the model to predict which patients will experience an event and which patients won't experience an event. The chart right there, you do receive this chart for every model, and I think it's on the end of the references themselves. And for reference, a C-index of 0.5 would be no better than a random. We might as well not model at all. A C-index of 1 would be perfect, and although we try very hard to reach that, we probably never will. A C-index of 0.7 to 0.8 would be considered very, very acceptable. And for our mortality all patients model that we have here, we have a C-index of 0.93. So now we have everything in order. We have the TQIP sample set. We have our exclusions identified. We have our models built. Then now let's review some of the benchmark basics. I wanted to just quickly take my captain audience and talk about statistics for a second. I want to review a few things to keep in mind when you are reviewing your benchmark report. Consider this histogram. These are some examples of some of the data quality reviews we do. Consider that histogram on the right there, that I believe is SBP. You can see it's very normally distributed. You can see the bell curve there. In cases like this, it would be very appropriate to present the measures of central tendency as mean and STD. However, most of our data doesn't look like that. It looks more like the histogram on the right there, which is time to angiography in hours, where you can see most of the data is clustered within a narrow range, and then we do have data that skews much higher number of hours there. In cases like this of skewed data, it's much more appropriate to present median and IQR. And the median is the 50th percentile, so it's that middle piece of data when the data is ordered. IQR is your 25th to your 75th percentile, so the middle range of your data. You'll see median IQR throughout the report. We talk a lot about odds ratios and confidence intervals, as I'm sure you know. Briefly, the odds ratio is a statistical estimate of the likelihood or odds of an outcome occurring at your hospital as compared to that outcome occurring at the average TQIP hospital after we've accounted for this patient variability. Confidence interval is just an estimate of the precision of the odds ratio. So we talk in terms of 95% confidence intervals. This means we can be 95% confident that your true odds ratio falls within that range. Risk-adjusted models provide odds ratios and a confidence interval for every model built. And in TQIP models, lower ORs are always better than higher ORs because modeled outcomes are undesired. So this risk-adjusted model output for any particular cohort is a nice way to view all of the data for your center and the entire TQIP sample at once. Probably what you're most interested in is the diamond there, which represents your center's odds ratio, and the line which represents the confidence interval. If that confidence interval lies completely above the reference line of 1, where odds ratio is 1, then you would be considered a high outlier. If your confidence interval line lies completely below the reference line, you would be considered a low outlier. And if your confidence interval crosses that ratio, that reference line of 1 at any point, then you would be considered indistinguishable from the TQIP average. So this is an example of our risk-adjusted output. These are the key metrics that you want to keep in mind. These columns are your hospital's raw data, so this is the data that you give to us that makes it through all of the patient inclusion criteria. This column is how TQIP expects your hospital to perform, so this is the output of the model. This is the TQIP average, so this column is identical for every table of this type on all of the reports. All of the other cells on this table are specific to your center. This is the comparison of your hospital to the average TQIP hospital, including the odds ratios, the confidence intervals, and your outlier status. Low outliers are, of course, highlighted in green. High outliers are highlighted in red. This is all mock data, so nobody has to be worried we're putting any centers on trial here. After the risk-adjusted tables, we have the risk-stratified tables or descriptive tables. These are all raw data for your hospital as compared to the TQIP sample by different cohorts. For fall 2023, we have broadened the extreme outlier highlighting on selected additional outcomes on the report that you've just received a few weeks ago. So that's some new stuff. When you receive a TQIP, when a TQIP benchmark report is released, the primary data contact at your facility will receive a zip file We encourage this primary data contact to share all of the documents within that zip file to any of the interested parties, and I'll just review what actually is included when it's delivered to you. Of course, you get your PDF, which includes all of the tables and charts that we've already been reviewing. You do receive a PowerPoint, which has those charts in a better resolution, maybe more appropriate for sharing or projection. You do receive an aggregate report, so this contains a lot of information about the TQIP sample as a whole. You do receive a code sets, which is an Excel spreadsheet that includes AIS codes and ICD codes that are used to define and determine many of the metrics in the columns throughout the report. There is an FAQ document, and then there's our famous reference document. We urge you to open the reference document first. Very importantly, it includes any changes, additions, deletions, corrections for this report versus the last report. I know everybody in here is going to ignore that advice and just open their PDFs immediately, but nevertheless, I've given this advice and we do hope that you take it. So this report does allow centers to compare your outcomes towards a common standard, but it is possible that there are other things that might influence your in-hospital mortality rates. One of these things is data itself. Results are only as good as the quality of data supplied, and everybody does a great job to keep the data quality very, very high, and there's always room for improvement there. We just have to stay very, very vigilant about that. TQIP also can only use the data that's available. Certainly there's probably other predictive things out there that we can't get our hands on or we can't link to patients, and so therefore we can't use that data. Every report does represent just a snapshot in time. Your performance of your center does change over time, so we urge you to keep that in mind and consider any report as a snapshot in time. Patient predictions. So we do supply these as a way to help identify patients that are potentially indicative of a trend, but we do urge you not to focus on any one patient as the sole explanation for your center's performance. Differences in discharge disposition or access to alternative levels of post-discharge care might influence in-hospital mortality rates. There was a question in the session this morning about how we use discharge to hospice, how we define those for mortality, and we do define those as a mortal patient, and we do that because those patients are assumed to have died, and we're trying to allay some of this bullet point right here. And there's chance. We do deal in a world of statistical estimates, and as hard as we try, it's not possible to entirely eliminate the role of chance. Thank you so much for your attention today. So just keep a few things in mind when you're reviewing your TQIP benchmarking. This is a tool that makes broad comparisons between your hospital and the average hospital across TQIP. It can indicate areas of opportunity for process improvement, as well as areas of program strength, and we certainly do want you to celebrate those areas of program strength and the great job that you're doing. And remember that you are the experts for your hospital, and only you can bridge the gap between the TQIP information that's provided and the reality that you see day to day at your center. Thank you again for your efforts in providing quality data in order to improve patient care, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks to Ben and Amy, that was great. I even learned something, and I've heard them talk about this a few times already. So now that we know what TQIP's perspective is on the benchmark report, we're going to have a few of the expert panel members come in and talk to you about what they do at their centers when they receive their benchmark report. And each of these members hold different roles within their hospital, so you'll hear those different perspectives. So we're going to start out with Andrea, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Thank you, Amy. Hello, everyone. So I'm Andrea Phillips. I'm the data analyst and team lead at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center in Toronto, Ontario. We are a level 1 adult site and recently became Canada's first ACS verified trauma center. So I have nothing to disclose. At my facility, each time we receive a benchmark report, we sit down and review it as a team. So the round table includes the trauma medical director, trauma services manager, PI coordinators, and the registry. Including the registry is so important as it's the registrars who are responsible for most of the data that goes into these reports. So at my site, there is myself and 3 other analysts in our registry, and we do all the data abstraction, coding, registry QA, data analysis, and reporting. We're also responsible for the TQIP data submissions, reviewing the submission frequency report, and ensuring adherence to all our data dictionary definitions. Our trauma services manager doesn't even have access to our registry. Our medical director and manager have 100% trust in our ability to run our registry. Okay, maybe 98%. So during the review, we looked at the unknown rates for risk-adjusted variables. We had 3 to 5 times higher unknown rates of GCS motor and pupillary response compared to all hospitals. So this wasn't news to the registry, as it had been flagged by TQIP on a previous data quality report. At that time, we had ensured that the unknown data wasn't related to any submission upload issues or incorrect registry mappings. We had also pulled a sample number of EMRs to review and ensure that the data just wasn't being documented on the trauma bay nursing flow sheet. So steps had been taken to try to increase documentation, and we frequently share our unknown rates with our trauma emerge educator. So when my trauma medical director asked why we were missing so many GCS motor scores, we showed him this. So this is an example of a trauma bay nursing flow sheet. And for this patient, the first GCS wasn't documented until 43 minutes after the patient had arrived at our hospital. To which he said, okay, but every trauma patient receives a trauma team leader assessment note that includes vitals on arrival. So this is true. However, this is the assessment note that goes with that same patient. So the registry was not collecting these vitals for TQIP, as there's no exact time for when they're being documented. So how do we know that they are actually within 30 minutes of hospital arrival? But as the TMD pointed out, this patient arrived at our hospital at 03:30. The assessment started promptly at 03:30. And the vitals were taken at the time that the patient was transferred from the EMS stretcher to the hospital bed. So this occurs within minutes in our trauma bay and always within 30 minutes. So yes, as he says, these vitals were within 30 minutes of hospital arrival, and we could have collected GCS motor of 5 and pupillary response as bilateral reactive. Whoopsies, we messed up. So since then, we have revised our data source hierarchies for these variables and are happy to report that our unknown rates are now in line with all hospitals. So next, let's look at our MTP recommended ratio review. We had 7 patients in hemorrhagic shock, and 57% of those met the recommended transfusion ratio of plasma to PRBC of 1:1 or 1:2. This required a deeper dive into the data. So to locate the patients in this MTP metric, first we headed over to the ACS data platform. We logged in, and then we selected the operational report, followed by the data download report. Next, we selected the TQIP dataset, the reporting period which we would like to review, and select apply parameters. This brings up a list of all the patients that are included in a particular TQIP benchmark report. And located on the left-hand side, you'll find filters where you can drill down into the data. So to find our MTP patients, we first filtered for shock, initial systolic blood pressure of 0 to 90. Second, we filtered for MTP recommended ratio, yes or no. Now, the software does allow for multiple filters to be applied at once, and a list of the items that have been filtered for applies at the bottom. So here we can see that so far we have applied filters for MTP recommended ratio and the cohort of shock. So lastly, we needed all patients who were transfused greater than 6 units of PRBC within 4 hours of hospital arrival. But this data is in cc's, and the data that we entered into our registry is in cc's. But TQIP reports this metric using units. So how many cc's are in 1 unit of PRBC? So I went searching for answers in the resources files. And as Amy just mentioned, the resources files automatically download when you download your benchmark report. They include the aggregate report, benchmark report FAQs, references, and the reporting code set. Now, chances are, if you have a question about your benchmark report, the answer is going to lie in one of these files. And sure enough, in the references file, we found the transfusion data transformations. And it states, for each patient, milliliters were transformed into units using the following standard conversion rates, then rounded to the nearest whole unit. PRBCs is 325 milliunit, and plasma is 250 milliunit. But if 325 mil is 1 unit, then how many mils is greater than 6 units of PRBC? So this took a little math and Excel finagling for me to figure out, but it turns out that 2,113 milliliters is greater than 6 units of PRBC, and 2,112 milliliters or less is 6 units or less. Now, whole blood can be used in place of or in combination with PRBCs to meet this criteria as well. However, as my facility does not use whole blood, I only looked at PRBCs here for the conversions. So now that we know how many cc's are in the greater than 6 units, we're now able to circle back to the data download report and add a final filter for PRBCs greater than or equal to 2,113 mil. And voila, here are the 7 patients in the MTP metric. 4 meet the recommended ratio and 3 that do not. But how does this metric compare to what's happening at my facility? So TQIP's 325 mil per unit of PRBC is quite high compared to my facility. On average, our units are only about 250 mil each. So in actuality, we have to transfuse greater than 7 units of PRBC to meet the greater than 6 unit definition of the MTP metric. So because of this, we reran the MTP metric using our facility's 250 mil per unit. So one of the existing patients in the metric switched from not meeting the recommended ratio to meeting it, and an additional 2 patients now met the definition for hemorrhagic shock. Overall, there was a 29% increase in the denominator and an improvement in the MTP recommended ratio from 57% to 67%. Now, it's not to say that 1 unit size is right versus wrong, but I wanted to highlight the importance of understanding just how the TQIP metrics are calculated and defined so that we can better understand the results and how they apply to practices at our own facility. So moving forward, missing data might not be missing at all, And understanding the calculations behind the metrics increases our understanding of the benchmark reports. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. All right, next we have Dara.
Hello, I am Dara Dilger, Trauma Program Manager at Deaconess Hospital in Evansville, Indiana. And we are a Level 2 ACS Adult Trauma Center, and we are a state-designated adult pediatric center for Illinois. So to start off with, I have no financial disclosures. I am a member of the Trauma Quality Program Content Expertise Panel. So I wanted to start out today to talk a little bit about the background. When I became a trauma program manager, it was in 2020. So if you kind of remember, it was COVID chaos at that time. I walked into my office, my new job, and literally there was no one in the department. Everyone was working remotely. So that kind of created a few challenges. Luckily for me, though, I had some trauma PI experience from 2010 to 2013, so I did know trauma somewhat, but had not delved into those TQIP benchmark reports or that process in that role. We also had a senior registrar who had been with us since the beginning of the program, and she owned the trauma submission stuff to TQIP. She owned those reports, and she didn't like to share. She was a great registrar, but she also told me she was going to retire in 2021. So I knew we had to get other people in that department to learn this process. Then, of course, 2 months after she leaves, we have our first virtual site visit. I'm very happy to report we were successful in that, and that was awesome. We did have some staffing challenges as well. We had to hire some new registrars with had difference of experiences, and then we also had to hire an agency for registry to support us. So the reason I'm telling you all of this is because we had some challenges and we had some opportunity to learn more about the TQIP benchmark report and how you can drill down into those patients. So this brings me to the spring 2023 benchmark report. I was looking through my report and the risk-adjusted mortality by cohort, and not too bad, looking along until I get to that daggone last diagram right there. That diamond is not looking in a great place for me. So first thing I was thinking, oh my gosh, we're in the red, what do we do? You know, and as a trauma program manager, I knew that we had to look at things in two different ways. We have to look at the clinical side, how are we taking care of that patient, what are we doing, what can we improve on? But I also needed to look at that registry side. Is our data real? Is it validated? And I know we had to investigate this. So I decided to look at the risk-adjusted mortality over time. And as you can see, it's just stellar as it's keep going up over time. And one of the things I knew about our program was we've always focused on those activation patients, those ones that are sicker. So we put a lot more time in that, and that's a variety of reasons, but primarily staffing. So we didn't focus on those isolation patients as we should have, and as our data is showing. So I wanted to look at the hospital events for the same cohort. You know, we're in the green. That looks awesome. I'm excited we're in the green. But are we? So one of the things I knew is that I had to learn more about this TQIP benchmark report and how to look at the frequency reports, all of these things. And I thought, how am I going to do that? Well, ACS has provided you the TQIP participant hub, and it's got these resources in there for you. So this was very valuable, and you've seen some of these reports in some of the other speakers. So this is very helpful. So first off, I needed to know who my patients were. In the past, when we looked at TQIP reports, say unplanned ICUs, I didn't know how to do this, so I looked at all of our unplanned ICUs. Doing this is a much better way. So I identified our patients with this report. And again, as they did, they drilled down into more patient-specific information. And this report is amazing at filtering. You can filter out many things. And depending on what you're looking at, it's great. Because if I'm looking at isolated hips, I don't need to know about cranies. If I see a cranie, that's a whole nother problem. But this is a great report, and you can use it in so many different ways. So now I know who my patients are. I know I have to look at their charts and understand what's happening. So what do I look at? And there are so many different variables that you can look at. And I think as you're drilling down into these charts and looking at those, you will have aha moments where something else will pop up and you'll say, wow, I didn't even think about that. So again, this is really depending on what you're looking at. If you're looking at your brain injury patients, what you may look at is different than what I'm going to look at. So this brings me to the patients that I did look at. We had 15 isolated hip fractures that died. The median age for these were 90 years old. We had a 6-day median length of stay. Only one of the patients hit our highest activation for criteria. 3 hit the category 2 or second level, and 11 of the patients were not activated at all, which is pretty typical for this patient population. We had initial admission location for ICU, there were 4. There were 11 that were admitted to the floor. The median ICU length of stay was just 2 days, and the median vent days was about 9.5. And we had really one big outlier. It was a family trying to make that decision about the care of their loved one. The other thing you have to look at too, just because you have an isolated hip fracture doesn't mean these patients are all going to the OR. That's for various and sundry reasons why they may not. But 8 of our patients did. And then I really wanted to know, how long did it take us from the time they got to the hospital till the time they went to the OR? Because we know the outcomes and evidence-based literature shows us that the sooner we get them there, the better they do. So we did have 8 that went to the OR, and we had 27 hours was the median time frame. One of the other things I thought about too is, because we're trying to move them to the OR quickly, we still have to optimize them as much as we can preoperatively. So trying to understand the hospitalist or a geriatric consult or cardiology, someone to see that patient preoperatively to maybe give them their best chances. And we consulted 7 times out of the 8 surgeries. We have a pretty robust palliative care team, and we're really good usually about consulting with them, especially for this patient population. So we consulted on 11 of these patients. And I did look at the median time of arrival into the palliative care consult. It was about 90 hours. That was a little bit surprising to me because we usually are pretty quick at doing that, but there were some that were kind of outliers for us. We also had 9 of these patients were discharged to hospice, and as they were just talking about, that does count as mortality, and 6 died in the hospital. All of these patients were made comfort care. So one of the things I noticed from that registry review is we missed some risk factors for advanced directive limiting care. And as you just heard, if we had caught those 4 patients would have not hit our data. So that's huge. We had 2 dementias, we had 2 functionally dependent health statuses, we had anti-coag and 1 cirrhosis. So we have some opportunity, we had some missed risk factors. And this does impact your risk mortality or your risk-adjusted mortality. So when I looked at the total hospital events, because I said, we were in the green, that looks pretty good, except the patients died, right? That was the big event. When I looked at this for the total events, we had 6 unplanned ICUs, a delirium, CVA, 2 unplanned intubations, and a severe sepsis. What I did find was we had missed some hospital events. We had missed 2 unplanned ICUs, 2 unplanned intubations, a sepsis, and an AKI. So really, when you're looking at this, what were some of our opportunities? I think a big opportunity for us is that real-time focus on those isolated patients. And because ACS has been so great about adding FTEs into their books now, that has been very helpful. So real-time focus on those patients. Making sure when you're abstracting these charts that we're looking at those risk factors and those hospital events and catching those because they do impact your scores. And maybe earlier palliative care consults. The other thing is still focusing on that pre-hospital hospitalist or cardio consults preoperatively. So corrective action, we have created the geriatric hip fracture guideline working with our ortho medical director, so it has time frames in place about surgeries. We also have updated our geriatric guideline with a lot of new things, and that it does include the geriatric consult. I think that consult is going to be helpful. Right now, we're still working through those processes. We developed the plan and how it's supposed to work, but we still got some work to do with that process. but I'm eager to find out in time what those outcomes will be. Hopefully that will help us. We've done a lot of trauma registrar education, and part of that was the ICD-10 courses, which was very helpful to us, and all the other things, all the different things we've implemented. It's been very helpful for education. We now know we need to take a deeper dive into our data before we submit the report, and we've been learning a lot about that and what that looks like and what might catch your eye so you can look at that again. It's really important to review your data in your operational and your mortality meetings, because people can participate in that and help you identify issues with what's happening and maybe processes that will improve it. And one other thing that's important too is that for us is that concurrent chart abstraction. We have trauma PI nurses looking now at those isolated patients every day, and I think we are already starting to see other things that we're catching now. So I think overall that's going to be helpful. One of the other things I do want to mention, though, to you is when you're looking at your benchmark reports, don't just look at what you're not doing well. Look at the things that you are doing well. Because if you're doing something well, that means there's some process that you have effect in that area that you might be able to use somewhere else. So don't forget to look at that. Actually, ACS told us that was one of our site weaknesses. We focused on the red more than we should. We could look at the green, too. So your steps when you get this benchmark report. Review the report. I would also review all the resources that they have mentioned too that helps you understand your report better. Look at your outliers, understand what they are. And then you've got to determine your priorities for focus, because there could be several that you would like to look at. Get your patient list, run those reports, and filter out whatever you need or don't need to help you and make it it's quicker for you and more clean. Then you can drill down into those charts, and you can get help from your medical directors, or for us, like an orthopedic medical director, all those people that will help. Identify the OFIs, and then you got to create your action plan. That's all part of this performance improvement, is in changing something and making it better. And then reevaluate to see where you are. As we're moving to the end of this year, I just want to remind you to look at this new year, new goals, and new successes. And I thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Dara. All right, next we have Megan.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Megan Carroll. I am the trauma PI coordinator at Santa Rosa Memorial Hospital. It is a ACS verified level 2 trauma center. I have no financial disclosures and no non-financial disclosures. A little bit of background about our facility. Like I said, we're a level 2. We're up in Northern California, up in wine country. We have this is from 2022, about 3,000 patients that we put into our registry. About 2,000 go into the database, the NTDS. We admit about 2,000 patients, and we do a deep dive, in-depth PI review for about 39% of this total trauma volume. So I'm going to talk about the submission report deep dive, and I'm going to talk about a TQIP benchmark report deep dive. First, we're going to look at the data submission report, which helps us to ensure that the data we are submitting to TQIP is an accurate reflection of the care that we're providing. Secondly, we'll talk about the TQIP benchmark report and how to look for opportunities for improvement. In doing these deep dives, I always feel like I'm looking for Waldo, and I feel like Where's Waldo represents process improvement, as both require meticulous observation amid complexity. Searching for Waldo demands systemic scrutiny, just like identifying opportunities for improvement. Patience and perseverance are key in uncovering the hidden elements that contribute to overall picture in both Where's Waldo and opportunities for improvement. So let's get started. This is our spring 2023 benchmark report. The plot graph looks pretty good, right? We're in the green, and everybody would say, green is good, let's move on, keep going. But we have astute PI nurses, and we have a pretty good finger on the pulse on what is happening with our care. So this was something that we wanted to look further into. So we started at the beginning, and we looked at the submission report. It's a report that's downloaded from the ACS platform that shows you what is being submitted to TQIP. And I'm going to show you how to access it and what to do with that information. So first, you're going to go to the ACS data platform. You're going to click Upload. You'll go and choose your submission report. So if you're looking at your TQIP report benchmark, it's over a period of time, so you're going to probably need to look at multiple submission reports. But for this presentation, I'm going to take an aggregate of the submission reports and the problems that I found and kind of consolidate them into one. So this is what you'll get, kind of like what the other presenters were showing. You'll get the entire document once you download it, and it spits out into an Excel file. And so what I did is I filtered it out by unplanned ICU admissions. So just to kind of orient yourself to the Excel sheet, column A will give you the hospital events, C will tell you which events you're looking at, E will give you the count, and F will give you the percentage. It only gives you the count, but when you look at it, it can kind of help raise red flags of like, this number seems pretty high. We wanted to look at unplanned ICU admissions anecdotally, so this is where we started. So then we're going to go into the hospital events and figure out who these patients are. Unplanned ICU admit, you're going to click your marked values, and it's going to spit out your patients. It gives us 11 patients. So then what I did is we run a hospital events report. What I wanted to do is I'll filter that out by looking at unplanned ICU admissions and compared it to our submission report. And for this I found 4 patients. So we looked into each patient. So patient 1 and 2 stemmed from mapping issues within our database. So at our facility, all of the PI is put into our database. So however, challenges will arise when the registry closes a chart, but then PI will go into the chart to put some loop closure in, and we'll just forget to close the chart. So occasionally, that leads to instances where the chart remains active unintentionally by the PI nurse. So an active status and PEDS that upload to the chart to TQIP, and we learned that this is a crucial step to do as a preparatory step before submission. Additionally, we discovered the significance of executing the auto map data process, ensuring the accuracy of mapping for all charts. And this step's essential for the data to be put into the registry and translate it into the way that TQIP wants to see it. So for patient 3, this patient, it's important to note that the discharge date was February 10th. And initially, the PI nurse put the occurrence date for this patient as the date they reviewed the chart, which happened to be after the patient was discharged. So that kicked the patient out. And then for this patient, I was just showing you that. So this patient, patient number 4, this patient wasn't submitted because the unplanned ICU admission was on the patient's readmission date, not the initial visit. And when we look further into the filter, we wanted, because PI looks at everything, we wanted to see, well, what was going on. This actually was an unplanned, this was a planned ICU admit post-operatively. Can you see where Waldo is? So one of the exclusion criteria is that the patient had a planned post-operative ICU stay, meaning it was known, and so that excludes the patient. So in the past 2 years, our facility has undergone significant changes. We've implemented weekly meetings with the registry team, fostering a closer scrutiny of our hospital events. Through comprehensive education initiatives, we've successfully fine-tuned the TQIP report, ensuring a more precise reflection of the care we provide. It's important to recognize that while moving out of our green may not always be the popular choice, it enables our data to more accurately represent the quality of care delivered. So prioritizing accuracy over popularity ensures that our data truly mirrors the excellence in our care provided. So our lesson learned is ensure that all the charts are closed. So we run that report now. Run the auto mapping data to ensure mapping. The occurrence date, we use collector as an important field. Always refer to your resource documents. The NTDS only looks at the hospital events occurring on the initial visit, or PI looks at anything within that patient's stay. So it's important to switch mindsets when looking at your NTDS definitions versus your hospital PI definitions, because they could not be the same. Oh, and the investigation takes a very long time. So moving on to the next topic, the TQIP benchmark. Now I'm going to move on to the second, digging into the TQIP benchmark report. So when we got this report, it showed us that we had a significantly longer time to death in days than other hospitals. If anybody was looking for him, there he is. So data download report, you're gonna go to the operational report, you're gonna go to mortality, same thing, download it, see what you get. And this spit out 46 mortalities. So what we did is I went into the charts and I went to see what happened. 3 of those patients should have been excluded because they did have an advanced directive limiting care prior to the patient arrival. And then I wanted to look at palliative care versus no palliative care. And most of those patients had no palliative care. And the median days to death for those people with palliative care were 12 days. And then no palliative care was around 6 days and they had died. So the reasons why we kind of thought what was happening, on average it took us 7 days to get palliative care, but why did it take that long? We're kind of still figuring that part out. But the consults are happening at 7 days, and so once you have a patient at 7 days, the other patients were dying. And then with palliative care consults, patients are discharged more to hospice, which takes time to set up. So let's say you have a patient who's been hospitalized for 7 days, and then we consult hospice, but then on a Friday, nobody's gonna see them Friday, Saturday, Sunday, maybe even Monday. So that will also delay their care, their plan as well. Plus also, we've had families in the hospital for 7 days. They have a care team, they're comfortable, they have a support system, they're ready to go, they have a plan, but then you involve somebody else. And that kind of then, they need to reset and kind of regroup and say, what are we gonna do here? And that also takes more time. So this kind of opened up Pandora's box, and we started a bigger PI project where we're looking at all admitted patients, not just mortalities, and then looking at early palliative care versus late palliative care to better align with the geriatric guidelines and the palliative care best practices from the ACS. So that's still going on right now. So our goal for June 2024 is to have a palliative care consult within 3 days for 90% of trauma-admitted patients who need an appropriate consultation. So our lessons learned, early palliative care is better. Always look for an advanced directive limiting care, and then move past the box decile plots, those fancy ones that have all the colors and the lines and the diamonds that clearly tell you if you have a problem. Look at the tables for PI opportunities as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. All right, last but not least, we have Gina.
Good evening. Last order of business today. I'm the least favorite child, I guess. Anyway, thank you for being here. I am honored to be speaking, but I realize the price for that is you are airing your dirty laundry publicly to quite a significant number of people, but we all seem to be sharing in misery, so here I am. I'm going to preface my presentation by saying my preferred trauma PIPS process is a model of concurrent, valid, and vetted PI through a compulsive process of primary review. 100% of our cases are primarily reviewed by the PI coordinator or myself, with issues escalating to a secondary or tertiary level of review where applicable. I emphatically believe that in this model, no program should ever be caught off guard or surprised by its TQIP benchmark report. And although sometimes necessary, retrospective drill downs are reactionary, onerous, and time-consuming, when the ideal goal of a mature PIPS program should be to take on a more proactive approach. So under normal circumstances, I review submission frequency reports at the time of data submission only as a measure to ensure my mapping is intact. Data submission is ideally not the time to be validating and vetting your actual data. Note that I did mention the expression under normal circumstances and normally and ideally and all those words that we love, but retrospective drill downs and reviews are necessary under certain circumstances. There are programs new to TQIP or in the nascent phases of developing their PIPS program. That applies to me here. Brand new TPMs, brand new PI coordinators, brand new registrars who are learning the nuances of their TQIP benchmark reports should be comfortable with this. And the scenario in which I currently find myself 5 months ago, I'm an experienced trauma program manager who's new to an existing program. however new or mature or immature your program may be. And I'm looking to take stock, per se, of the current PIPS process, starting with a 30,000-foot view offered by my trauma program's benchmark report. And in doing so, I'm looking to assess both quality and process and outcomes measures. So my experience for the last 15 years has been at ACS Level 1 trauma centers with 16 years of extensive ED clinical experience in high volume, high acuity urban EDs. So I had a learning curve when I accepted the TPM position at a state designated Level 3 trauma center in Virginia Beach in July. And, well, let me forward, I'm sorry. I should have started with, sadly, I have nothing to disclose because I don't. So I picked up my benchmark report and figured this is the best way to get to know my program. Where should I start? And very humbled to learn, thinking coming from a level 1 to a level 3, that things might be a little bit easier for me, which they're not. As you can see, I have 1,922 registry cases for the same reporting year in my benchmark report. Of those, I have 1,410 NTDS cases and a total number of TQIP cases at 1104, which is 78.3% of my NTDB cases. Did I mention I'm a level 3? These are volumes commensurate with a level 1. They are doing some serious business at this level 3 trauma center. So I pick up my benchmark report and I start thumbing through it. Very beginning of the benchmark report, first page. Okay, I don't like that 8th decile, but I'm still average. I am going to come back to that slide, actually. And there's the associated caterpillar graph. Next graph, a lot of red, a lot of high, and a lot of 10th decile. That does not look so good. And there's the associated ugly caterpillar graph with my ugly table. And I flip the page, and more red, more high outlier, more 10th decile. And there is the ugly caterpillar graph associated with that ugly table. Now, this is right about the part that I drop a 4-letter expletive that we all know and love, and there may or may not be a typo here. So now I'm asking myself, where do I start? What are the major complications with my major complications, including death? And do I have a data problem or a risk-adjusted outcomes problem? Now, this benchmark report has 45 pages, and I'm about 1/4 of the way through. And yes, I did find additional dirty laundry in the remaining pages, but I do only have 10 minutes here, so we're going to start with what I just presented because these are good examples of low-hanging fruit. You can't fix your entire report at once. You need to probably find what you think you can impact the most at once as well before you get going. So I start where every good TPM, registrar, or PI coordinator will start. I start with my submission frequency reports. And a quick way to get there, as my colleagues have also mentioned, going to go into the platform, into your upload, and you're going to click onto your submission frequency report. And has been mentioned, if you submit 1/4 of a time, you will need to review all 4 submission frequency reports for the 4 quarters represented in your TQIP benchmark report, which represents a full year. So I'm perusing it, looking for things that just don't seem right, and something you can export your submission frequency report, which I do. I perused it, and something jumps right out at me. And this is advanced directives limiting care. Considering I've got quite an elderly cohort, I'm a little surprised that there is 1 case in the entire submission frequency report and none in the other 3 of patients with advanced directives limiting care. So we're back to this slide again. Gina, what's the big deal? I see no red, I see no high outlier, I see no 10th decile. Don't let your guard down. If you see your programs in the 8th, 9th, or 10th decile, but you're still an average outlier rather than a high outlier, it's simply indicating there's significant variability in the data. You are still performing worse than 80, 90, or 100% of the centers that are in your TQIP cohort. So now that TQIP benchmark reports and I, many years later, we've been dating a long time. I've been doing this for 10 years. We're old friends. But I cannot emphasize enough to you that understanding your benchmark reports and using your references to do so is how you're going to learn to interpret your TQIP benchmark report. It's extremely helpful in interpreting every aspect of your TQIP benchmark report, your inclusion criteria, your exclusion criteria, caterpillar graphs, odds ratios, quartiles, outcomes, cohort definitions. So how do we get to those? We're going back into our data center. We are going into the library. You're going to find the benchmark report that you're interested in, open it up. You're gonna have a zip file there, and contained within the zip file are your TQIP references. I open them up with every new benchmark report, and I refer to everything because these things change over time. Definitions change over time. And what do I stumble upon right here on page 8? The inclusion and exclusion criteria. Note, the exclusion criteria, as my colleagues have also mentioned, exclude patients with a pre-existing advance directive to withhold life-sustaining treatment. Well, let's refer to the data dictionary, get you a little more specific and helps us to understand what you need to be able to enter this on a case. And that is that it must be, excuse me, I can't even read that very well. The written request actually has to be dated and timed before the patient arrives to your hospital. The advance directive must actually limit care. It just can't be an advance directive. And there are a list of treatments in here to consider limiting care. And the fourth thing is that they actually cannot, oh my goodness. They cannot have, they cannot have the report element in which patients with it, oh my goodness, I can't read that, did not limit life-sustaining treatment. So sorry, I should know that off the top of my head. You go dry up here sometimes. So they have to meet two of these inclusion criteria, and they must not meet the exclusion criteria. So let the drill down begin. I'm gonna go into my benchmark drill down, into the TQIP participant hub, into my data center, and from there I'm gonna go into my operational reports, the data download report for the specific benchmark report you want, and from there I'm gonna go into my outcomes, and I can actually export them just like I can everything else. And what I find of those 36 patients, elderly patients, is that even though my registry only had one with advanced directives limiting care, when I drilled down on all 36 deaths, actually 30 of them had advanced directives scanned into the electronic health record. But I had to drill down and open those advanced directives up, A, to make sure they were dated prior to the injury, and secondly, that they limited care. So this is a little bit onerous and takes a little bit of time. And at the end, of the 36 cases, 15 of those cases had advanced directives that actually limited care. They were scanned into the electronic health record. They were signed and dated prior to the injury, and the directives actually limited or withheld life-sustaining treatment. There were 15 additional, most of which didn't limit care. And when I opened them, the patients were very clear that they wanted all heroic measures. They wanted all life-sustaining treatments. And I had 2 or 3 that were scanned in under advanced directives that actually were simply healthcare proxies. So that is not an advanced directive limiting care. So do I have a data problem or a care delivery process and systems problem? Well, I know I have a data problem, but I still do not know if I really have a care delivery problem for that cohort, but I'm pretty certain that if we were able to exclude those 46% of the patients with an advanced directive, it's going to move the needle for what decile we fall into. Another low-hanging fruit was major hospital events, and geez, what are these? Again, a lot of red. I'm going to refer back to those references again, and these have changed over time as well, that there are 13 major hospital events of the 22 or 23 NTDB hospital events that are considered major. So if I go into my TQIP benchmark report, and I did go into my hospital events, the very first 3 I noticed were pretty high outliers. We are 6 times the benchmark for our the acute kidney injury. We're about 18 times the benchmark for acute respiratory distress syndrome, and we're more than double the benchmark for cardiac arrest with CPR. And because I'm privy to the fact we might have a data problem, I'm going to drill those down. So starting with the low-hanging fruit of acute kidney injury, I'm going straight into the data dictionary. I want to double check the definition before I drill down, and then I'm going to go in and drill down. and one last time into the data center, into your operational reports. You're going to go into your data download report, pull up the benchmark in which you're interested, and again, you're going to go right down to the bottom to hospital events, and you can export these data. And once you do, you're able to find the specific cases and go in. And what I found, there were 23 patients in our TQIP benchmark report with AKI. It's pretty high. I think for anybody, that's pretty high. And when I drilled down, what I found is I was able to exclude 7 because the condition was actually present on admission. 13 met exclusion criteria that they never met the inclusion criteria, which left me with a total number of cases of 3 AKIs. Now, in all fairness, I came to a program that's had significant turnover. They were without a trauma program manager for 8 or 9 months before I came. We have 1 of 3 original registrars left, 2 brand new PI coordinators, and a new TMD. So there's really not many people left to even remediate, but we're starting from scratch here. And I'm sure some of you with the turnover found yourself in a similar position. The next thing I did take a look at, for example, is ARDS. And as you can see, we're 18 times the benchmark for ARDS. Now, anybody who knows these definitions knows that ARDS is an extremely difficult complication to meet. And coming from a level 1, if we saw 3 or 4 a year in our very sick case mix, that was high. So I was very suspicious that our little level 3 had 18 ARDS. And I went back into the drill down, I pulled out those 18 patients, onerously dug through their charts, and none of them had ARDS. Now, I am in no way, shape, or form implying that we don't have ARDS. I just reviewed one maybe a few weeks ago. But these are errors of inclusion. I do not have the bandwidth to go in and look at the other 1,086 cases to see if they met the definition for ARDS. So, you know, you can't be lulled. We spend a lot of time talking about things we remove, but there are errors of omission too, so you should suspect all of it. And what I did find with these 18 cases is I think, you know, I'm not aware of the clinical savviness of the registrars who are no longer with us, but what I did see in all of these charts is acute respiratory distress or acute respiratory failure. And most of these 18 cases also had unplanned ICU or unplanned intubations associated with them. So I think there was an opportunity here for people that are no longer with us. So the last hospital event is the cardiac arrest with CPR. We were double the benchmark. Again, you're gonna pull out the definition before I do the drill down to make sure the patients that are in there actually met the definition. And what I found is 2 actually did not. And the sample size is much smaller. So these 2 that did not met exclusion criteria because they had CPR on arrival to the trauma center. And that is exclusion criteria. And you have to wonder, when you're removing cases like this, I've removed 18 cases of ARDS from our database, what that's going to do to the rest of your data for the next, TQIP benchmark report. If you are removing things in that mass, it's going to move the needle on your reports as well because we're benchmarking against one another. So do we have a data problem or do we have a care delivery and process systems problem? I know I have a data problem. It would be remiss of me to come in as a new trauma program manager and affect any change based on this TQIP benchmark report right now. You cannot determine whether there's an opportunity for clinical practice or process improvement within valid data set. Reactionary damage control approach to TQIP benchmark report is not ideal. Sometimes it is necessary when you're trying to figure things out quickly and do some damage control. It's very inefficient and time consuming. It takes hours. And quite frankly, I'm not going back to fix this entire benchmark report. I'm going to take that period of time to look forward and affect some positive change in education in the future benchmark reports. And an opportunity to impact your TQIP benchmark reports does lie at this juncture if you can go in and do some fixing. But if you're going to remove things because you think there are errors of commission in your registry, it's a little skewed to do that, but not go back and review the 1,000 cases for AKI to see if they might have indeed had it. So you have to be consistent in your suspicion of your data. And as I've mentioned, ideally, a proactive PIPS process includes registry validation via a concurrent identification, review, and vetting of hospital events. review of a submission frequency report for mapping issues prior to final submission, and a comprehensive data quality plan will certainly help fix that. And this is now required, and you'll be hearing a bit more about the data quality plans tomorrow. I believe that trauma registry stewardship is the charge of the entire trauma program and the PIPS process, not on one individual. And data errors work in both directions, as I mentioned. So I removed 18 ARDs, but I did not review 1,086 other cases to see if they might have had ARDs. If you've identified one type, you likely have both. And ideally, primary review process should include every trauma registry case if you have the resources to do so. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. Well, thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this session, and I hope you also go to the welcome reception downstairs. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can email traumaquality@facs.org, and we'll be glad to answer them for you. Thanks again.